Someone has said, tell the people a lie, and if they hear it enough, they will believe it. We know that was Adolf Hitler, one of the most grotesque individuals to have ever drawn breath. Yet today, over 70 years later, after those words were uttered, many Westerners are unknowingly espousing his particular ideology. Now that sounds like a very profound thing to say, and some might even take issue with it. But let's think about it. There are myths in our society. Number one, that the rich create jobs. You hear this on Fox News over and over and over again. I about fell off my chair the other day when Greta asked the question, well, then if that's true, from another Fox commentator who made the original statement, then why aren't they investing in America? Then, of course, they blamed the Obama administration for the reason the wealthy are not creating jobs in America. Then you hear the other side of the equation that says, well, it's small businesses that create 97% of the jobs in America. Well, which is it? Now, number one, let's get at least a few generally understood facts laid down here. Number one, social programs that help maintain our society come to a little over $400 billion. That includes what we would call in ancient times, about 50 years ago, entitlements, such as, your VA benefits, unemployment, food stamps, and publicly subsidized housing. Others are libraries, waterworks, universities, and government-sponsored bills for education and so forth. Now, if we take a very simplistic view of what we call supply and demand economics, then one would think that the capitalistic system would work. But the reason it doesn't is because you have a shift in the dispersion of wealth from the bottom to the top if you have unbridled capitalism. Well, the left wing really doesn't get it any better either, because if you have government intervention on every side, and by the way, what we really have in America is a combination of both. So we've really got the worst of both worlds, if you really analyze it, in spite of the fact that America was built on beautiful idealism. Now, it's interesting that the constitutional fathers actually believed to be a citizen who had the eligibility to vote that you had to be a landowner and you had to be male. Today we look at that and we read the term persons to mean all Americans who are citizens of the USA. So we've made a lot of improvements over civil liberties that we are now losing. Why does this circle of events come back to haunt us? Number one, as the wealth shifts, it used to take 200 times the wages of a principal of a high school to reach that of a CFO. Now it takes 500. It used to take just about 30 minutes of labor to actually put a plate of food up on your table. Now, if you really look at it, it takes $10 just to heat up the stove. Why is that? Well, number one, your plate of food that sits on your table every night has been trucked or transported by train over 1,500 miles before you buy it from the grocery store till it ends up from the warehouse, from the grocery store to your table. It doesn't matter if they grow these particular foodstuffs right in your local community, because when you globalize everything, it destroys the local markets and everything is put on global pricing. Before 1974, America had over 70 different oil companies. You could drive down the landscape and you would see Gulf, Husky, Time, 76 Union, they're still out there. Conoco was married to Phillips 66. Flying A, Mobil, Esso, which was part of Humble, and on the list would go. Most of the oil reserves that were produced in America were from America. So the $770 billion that OPEC began to siphon off from the American and British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and many other Western nations had economic reverberations, not in the United States, where immediately half of our wells were capped, but also when this oil sands refinery gets built and the oil is shipped to Houston, Texas, it will create a few American jobs. But by and large, this oil will be placed, you guessed it, on the open market. What's wrong with an open market? Well, it's backed by speculators. It's backed by the rise and fall of the New York Stock Exchange. What else is wrong with it? Mom and pop gas stations are no more. Small oil companies, with very few exceptions, do not exist, and it prevents us from developing new technologies. It keeps us from using natural gas and other reserves that we have plenty of. This descent into slavery that we have bought into because labor unions weren't perfect, so now we don't need collective bargaining at all, even though about 13% of the workforce in America is unionized. We want to destroy the last vestiges of any of these institutions so we can be free to work for minimum wage and just slightly more. Right to work states such as Idaho. The average person goes back to work for $9.05 an hour. And I know so many people who buy into the corporate myth that even though the $400 billion that is paid out in social welfare, and it's way too much, when you can go into the service, come out with a minor injury, and be taken care of for life. We don't want social welfare for the elderly or for the medically enslaved, but our congressmen get it. The HMOs have record profits. Our corporations have over $870 billion in tax write-offs that you and I pay for. Did you hear it? Who subsidizes those corporate bailouts? We do. And the Obama administration paid the big boys off first. And now it's back to trickle-down voodoo economics. Nothing changes. And yet the 200 tycoons who are on corporate-sponsored radio because they destroyed the local market potential there too, that was supposed to belong to the general population. They don't seem to understand that this $860 billion is provided by the American taxpayer so they could invest in the United States in rebuilding our educational system, in rebuilding railroads, in rebuilding a space program, in rebuilding a water works that is modern instead of one in decay. So we could rebuild a public school system that used to be the envy of the world. And now we look back on it, and America is the most regulated, overtaxed for middle income folks. And now we have the economic bondage of if you do not have health insurance, if you go to the hospital for a one-night stay can cost you $30,000 to $50,000, even if very little has been found to be wrong with you or whoever's the patient. Drug companies make record profits, and yet senior citizens go without the help they need. This is going to cost the United States of America more in the long run with an aging, sick, and more people thrown into the criminal justice system. It is a recipe for abject failure, and it is something that no Western nation worth its salt would ever be willing to allow. Labor unions were not the total answer, but they were a voice that workers had because America refused to create a system of labor and arbitration across the United States that would be not only influenced by good labor legislation, but that would be upheld by arbitrators across the United States in every public city where grievances could be filed and you wouldn't need labor unions. This is Father Tom Roberts saying we'd better wake up and smell the coffee, or there isn't going to be much of a future. Thanks for listening.